I think we all appreciate a little bit about how dependent we are on energy and what it does for us. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. This crowd is significantly bigger than it was when I was out here last year during the blackout. So I'm going to recap a little bit about what I talked about last time without going through all the gory detail. So I'm going to be talking basically today about global warming and how that ties in with what the EPA is doing. And it is a very, very critical issue to us, more so than most people know. Now, just so we start off as talking about energy, this is where we are as a planet, as far as what energy we use. This is a pie chart that basically looks at the energy sources that maintain our quality of life. This big green chunk of pie that you see down on the bottom left-hand corner, that's oil, petroleum. It is a big chunk of the energy that we use. These proportions, by the way, are pretty similar in the U.S. The next biggest chunk is in the upper right-hand corner. That's about a quarter of the energy we use. That's coal. And then this red chunk down here in the bottom right-hand corner, that's natural gas. So between coal, natural gas, and petroleum, we're talking 80% plus of the world's energy supply. Now, politicians talk about replacing that. I'm not positive they have an idea of the scope of the amount of energy that this represents. It's huge. It's a huge amount of energy. And without this, our life would be very different. Because there was a time when we weren't using any of those three. You go back before the Industrial Revolution. We weren't using those three sources. We weren't using petroleum. If coal was being used, it was being used to heat homes at that time. But biomass was also used. Wood, cut down tree, throw logs in the fire, that kind of thing. And natural gas wasn't being used. Most human history, we didn't use this kind of energy at all. This is a recent invention of ours, and it's a pretty darn good one. Because in the last 100 years, we have made more technological innovations in this country by itself than for the whole planet over all human history combined. Why? Well, part of it is that we have available, cheap energy to run that economy. It runs the engine of the economy. You take the engine out of the car, what good's the car? This is the engine of our economy. Without this, we have a car with no engine. Now, per capita, how much energy do we use? Now, this is one of the confusing things because energy comes in a bunch of different units. When you buy energy in petroleum, you buy per gallon, right? It's over $4 a gallon today, by the way. Boy, it's been a while since I saw that down my street. But we buy gasoline by gallon, and we buy our electricity. If you get a bill from DTE or consumers for electricity, it comes in kilowatt hours. They bill you per kilowatt hour. And if you buy natural gas, it comes in, you pay per cubic foot. So they're all different units, but if you get it down to just energy, say a kilowatt hour, you can convert a gallon of gas to kilowatt hours. You can convert a cubic foot of natural gas to kilowatt hours. So if you look at all the energy that we use as a country in kilowatt hours, per capita, that means 310 million Americans. Each one of us, on average, uses about 100,000 kilowatt hours per year. Now, is that a little? Is that a lot? The only way to get a sense of that is comparing us to what other countries use. So, just for reference, other countries. At the top of the list here, I have other developed countries. Now, what's an other developed country? That's France, that's Spain, that's Britain, that's Japan, other developed countries. I'm not talking third world here. They use less than half of us. Now, some people would immediately jump on that and says, you know, we can be just like France, just like Germany, just like Spain. Why don't we just use half of what we're using right now? You know, there's a downside to using only 48% of the energy that we use. Let me just give you an example that I always give. What's a heat wave? Well, we just had a kind of a heat wave from March. Broke a few records here. Now, when they say broke records, they mean in like the last 120 years. I mean, for Earth's history, that's like nothing. It's like, hey, we broke a record for the last 6 hours. Cool. What's been going on the last few years? You know, that kind of thing. But anyway, so kind of had a heat wave, but a heat wave in the summer, something that they would call a heat wave in the summer for Michigan. What would that be? How hot would it have to get before they declare a heat wave in Michigan? 98, usually right around 100 is a heat wave. And if it stayed, it's got to stay there for I think 2 more days or 3 more days, something like that. They got rules and look, they get their hands on anything, and all of a sudden it's definitions and this and that. But about 100 degrees sustained for 2 or more days. France's climate is pretty similar to ours here in Michigan. They had a heat wave in 2003. The temperature rose to about 100 degrees and stayed there for 3 days, a long weekend. And 15,000 people died. 15,000 people died. For a country much smaller than ours in terms of population. 15,000. Why? I mean, it's not a third world country. We're talking France. They drive cars, they got an economy, etc. Energy is not cheap over in Europe. It's expensive. And things that are expensive, people that can't afford it don't get it. You think gas is bad at $4 a gallon? Try 10. That's what it is over there. It's not that petroleum is that expensive, it's that they tax the heck out of it. And that changes people's behavior, which is the whole point. That's how you change people's behavior, right? If gas was $10 a gallon, let's say they impose a tax tomorrow and gas went up to $10 a gallon. Would that not change your behavior or mine? Yeah, that's what they would want. So the behavior of people over in Europe is very different than here. A college buddy of mine is working right now in the UK. He's been there, in one of the suburbs of London, what we call suburbs anyway. But when they take a vacation, it's a half hour out of the city. You gotta be kidding me. It's a half hour out of the city. And here, people drive an hour each way commuting from work. Over there, you go an hour away. That is vacation distance. Very, very different. Well, that means that over there, people are very urbanized. Which is, by the way, what liberals kind of want, right? They want people just in the city and that kind of thing, dependent on one another, this big, huge commune kind of thing. So it's very different over in Europe. But in addition to the high gas prices, all energy prices are more expensive over there than over here. And they also sign on to things like, have you ever heard of the Kyoto Protocol, to limit greenhouse gases? Well, they signed on to that. Refrigerants are greenhouse gases. So all of a sudden the AC becomes expensive, not just because the electricity is more expensive, but because they're limiting greenhouse gas. One of the ways you limit that is you make products more expensive that have greenhouse gases. People didn't have AC. And you get a heat wave and 15,000 people die. Now, would you and I tolerate that here? How many people keel over in Florida? I mean, look at France, it was most of the 15,000 were elderly, without AC, and they couldn't make it for those 3 days. Now, Florida, I mean, what's Florida famous for? Our grandparents are keeling over left and right down there. They're fine. They go from their air-conditioned house to their air-conditioned car, the air-conditioned grocery store, and they're fine. In very hot, very humid weather in Southern California and Phoenix, Arizona, and New Mexico and Texas. And there's not 15,000 people at a clip dying. They're fine because they have access to the technology to keep them fine. And it's cheap and it's affordable. It's a different quality of life. I've had people argue with me, hey, Europe, the quality of life is higher. No, it's not. It's different over there. You don't have the freedoms that we do here. We all have AC. Do you? A lot harder to get over there. So being down here at 48,000, half the energy, there is a negative consequence to that. And it's a quality of life issue. Now, if we go down to mid-developed countries where they're using only 15% per capita of the energy we're using, would you believe it if I told you that China's in that list? They're not underdeveloped. They are mid-developed. Most of their population of 1.4 billion people are peasants without any modern conveniences whatsoever. As a matter of fact, if all those peasants came into the cities, the economy would collapse like a cheap Kmart picnic table. Nothing against Kmart. It would collapse. They couldn't sustain it. Their booming economy is limited to the big cities, Shanghai, Beijing, etc. Most of their population is agrarian, living on the same plot of land, same as their ancestor, generation after generation after generation, thousands of years. We don't know that. All we hear are, hey, the economy's booming, etc. Well, it is booming for very few. They're down there as a mid-developed country. India is down there as a mid-developed country. They only use 15% of the energy we do per capita. Where did Mother Teresa go to fight poverty? She went to Calcutta, India. I mean, you're going to fight poverty, go to poverty. A lot of poverty over there. The quality of life is very bad for the average Indian. Especially compared to us, what we have. And then at the bottom of the list, we have these mid-developed countries that only use 3% of the energy we do. Now we're talking third world countries. We're talking about the Afghanistans. Really no central government, even though they pretend to have one. It's very tribal. There are warlords. It's regional, etc. Countries in Africa, basically no governmental structure whatsoever. Everybody's on their own. There is no infrastructure of any kind. All right. Now, where do they get their energy from, by the way? They're still using 3,000 kilowatt hours. From what? Well, it's themselves and their animals. That's it. They're doing it themselves, like everybody had to do back in the day. You know, one of the classes I teach over at the university is a class on alternative energy, and one of the things I go through is the history of the wind turbine. The wind turbine is kind of a popular thing right now. Wind turbines have been around for thousands of years. You can go 3,000 BC and find drawings and paintings of wind turbines. And from 3,000 BC to 2000 AD, or close to it, actually 1900 AD, the design of the wind turbine didn't change. Windmills. They didn't change for 5,000 years. Why? People had no time to invent a better one. Everybody was out there working, eking out a meager existence. Low lifespan, you were working all the time. Look, we have universities now, working at a university. That's a pretty recent invention, historically. Hundreds of years ago, there was no Institute of Higher Ed. People didn't really make it out of elementary school if they even went to elementary school. Once they were old enough to work on the farm, they worked on the farm, and they carried on for their father, and then they had their own family, and their sons carried on for them, etc., etc., and it just kept going generation to generation. There was no time to go get an education and come up with new technology for this, that, and the other thing. They were eking out a meager existence. For most of human history, that's how we live. And every now and again, in human history, there comes a point where some civilization figures out how to maintain a much higher quality of life. The Roman Empire started out that way. They're way ahead of their time. We are the biggest blip ever seen on that historical map. Out of all the disorder, out of people throughout human history, eking out a meager existence, all of a sudden, here we come to USA. And we have this gigantic spike in quality of life that has never been seen in human history, ever. Nothing like it's ever occurred. And now we have a totally different set of challenges. But I'll get to those. That just kind of puts us where we are on the map. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing that we're using all this energy. By the way, this came out just this month, March, middle of March. In China, millions make themselves at home in caves. From the UK Daily Mail. It's not a joke. Millions. Caves. And they're happy that they have a cave to live in. I'm not kidding. You read that article. I mean, look this up. In China, millions make themselves at home in caves. Look it up on Google. You find the article. It's 2 weeks old. It's not even that. Millions. That's a pretty different quality of life than we have. All right? And they're happy with that compared to what they have. There was another article in one of the UK papers about, I think it was Camp 14 in North Korea, where one person escaped that camp, the only known person ever escaped that camp. If you read that, it is absolute evil what they do to people over there. Absolute evil. By the way, if you were to hire people to give you the energy that big oil gives you, that DTE gives you, that Consumers Energy gives you, you'd have to hire 670 people to maintain the quality of life that you and I have today. Last time I talked to this group, I went into gory detail about how I got that. If we didn't have all this available energy out there, you'd have to hire people to do the things that electricity does for us, and petroleum does for us, and natural gas does for us. You'd have to hire people to do that. You would need to hire 670 people to do that. That's a lot of people, by the way. That's how we live. If you've ever seen that commercial with the hundreds of people following the guy with a cell phone, you know, your network, That's pretty accurate as far as the scale goes of what you would need. You would need an army of people behind you. Now, very few people in history were able to hire that many people to work for them. And we got names for them, but I'll get to that. My Star Trek, my famous Star Trek lesson, I do this all the time because it's very important. How many people here are fans of Star Trek? Oh, heck yeah, that's what I'm talking about here. About 60% of you. When I was a kid growing up in Detroit in the 70s, I got a chance to watch 1 hour TV a day. That's it. That's the limit my parents gave me. Probably a good thing to do with kids these days, but anyway. I watch Star Trek every time. The old one. Spock, Kirk. There were reruns because the show was back from the 60s. But man, I loved that show. And then the Next Generation, all the spin-offs from that, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, etc. I watched them all. Some were better than others. But when I became an engineer in my adult life, I boiled this show, the whole Star Trek universe, down to one fundamental notion that makes the Star Trek universe work. It's only one thing. And that is, in the Star Trek universe, for it to work the way it does, because in the Star Trek universe, they no longer deal in money. Nobody gets paid. The monetary system's gone. I mean, there were several episodes about that. They're pretty explicit. There is no more money. We don't do that anymore. I don't think the system would work, but anyway. But the whole thing is underpinned by the fact that they have unlimited free energy. Energy is available to everyone in the Star Trek universe in whatever quantity they want, and it's free. I've never seen them pay. I mean, remember, they're out of money. They don't have money. They just get energy, and you do whatever you want. Look, in the Star Trek universe, you beam yourself from one place to another using energy. You can replicate your own food. You go up to a machine and you speak into it. I want coffee at this temperature, and I want a steak dinner, and I want this. And it just magically appears. And there are holodecks where they can recreate their own virtual realities, and all the energy they want. I don't know one episode of the show that talked about energy efficiency. Which is my biggest energy of interest, by the way. Nobody talked about it. They just use whatever they need. Yeah, the warp core, I mean, just pump it out. All that you need, and it's free. That's the utopian future we're looking at. I mean, in the Star Trek universe, right, they made all this technological progress. They got beyond the monetary system, and their health care is now non-invasive. They got all these little devices that send. Everything is just so cool, and it's all predicated on unlimited, dirt cheap energy. Which I think is where we kind of want to go. We want to keep energy available, and we want to keep it cheap. If any one of those two things goes the other way, technological progress is going to slow. If the availability of energy and or the price of energy changes in a bad direction, our economy can grind to a halt. Our technological innovation can grind to a halt. It can happen. Our economy is predicated on cheap, available energy. Now, let me get beyond this. Here's the people that had anywhere near 670 people working for them. We used to call them pharaohs, monarchs, kings, queens. And that was it. And they didn't have 670 people at their beck and call, by the way. They had a much smaller crew than that. No emperor. Look up any of these people in the history book. Pharaohs, kings, queens, emperors. Any of them. Biggest people in the history books. The Napoleons, the Alexander the Greats, the people that were going to take over the entire planet. They could not even conceive how you and I live life. Our quality of life, yours and mine, are better than any of these people in the history books. Any of them. They would not be able to conceive of the lifestyle that we live. They didn't have that. It didn't matter how many people they hired. They didn't have the stuff we have today. It was inconceivable to them. And this is just average, me and you. Average Joes. We're just average Americans. We're not talking about wealthy people. You and I live better than anybody in history. Bar none. It's going to make reading history books a little different now. That's okay. let me ask you this question, because this has to do with our standard of living and how far we have progressed in 100 years. Let me just go back a little farther than 100 years, 1906. Anybody tell me what the leading cause of death was in 1906?
Pneumonia. TB.
TB. Exhaustion.
Pneumonia.
That was a cause of misery, exhaustion. It wasn't a leading cause of death. Number one leading cause of death was influenza and pneumonia. Number two is tuberculosis. How many people know what tuberculosis is? You heard it. How many of your kids or grandkids wake up fearful every morning that they're going to contract tuberculosis or pneumonia or contract polio and be crippled for life, or, and I can just go down the list. How many of your kids or grandkids live in fear of those diseases today? Nobody. You have to read about tuberculosis somewhere else. Still out there. You go to less developed countries, oh yeah, you're going to see it over there. Malaria, diarrhea. What do kids do with diarrhea? They sing the diarrhea song, right? You guys ever see the movie Parenthood? That's how the movie Parenthood with Steve Martin started out. Our kids sing songs about these things that used to be leading killers. That's the quality of life that we have. All these things that we used to go to sleep in fear of, wake up in fear of. We don't do that anymore. Our kids are living in a world that's never occurred before. There's no fear of polio. I mean, disease was a big thing. Now, can anybody tell me what the leading cause of death 100 years later is? So now we're talking 2006, just a few years ago. Number one cause of death. I don't hear the right answer anywhere. Number one is abortion. Oh, yeah. Number one is abortion. Now, I put an asterisk in there for two reasons. Number one, that's minus 3 states that weren't reporting at that time. That's only for 47 states. Number two is the CDC does not list this as a cause of death. You kind of figured that at this point, right? That's the number one leading cause of death in the United States. Number two is heart disease. 3 is cancer. 4 is stroke. Respiratory disorders. Number 5, accidents, diabetes, Alzheimer's. Except for number 5. That list didn't exist 100 years ago. Except for number 5, respiratory disease. That's like pneumonia. The other 7 were never in large enough quantity to be of any concern. Notice, diarrhea is not on there. Yeah, that is a good thing. Tuberculosis, not on there. We live in a very, very different world. Very different world. Lifespans are now so high. I mean, Alzheimer's is a big thing out there. They never heard of that 100 years ago. There may have been a case or two that they couldn't diagnose something's going on. Lifespans were shorter. Our medical technology has increased to that point where we now live very long, fruitful lives. Didn't used to be the case. So, I'm sorry? Say what again? Oh. The food coma hasn't set in for you yet, has it? So yeah, back to these guys. Monarchs. Now, since we're talking about global warming and EPA, this really ties into liberty and freedom. That's really what we're talking about. We need to protect liberty and freedom. That's what this country was predicated on. Declaration of Independence. Where do our rights come from? It's supposed to come from the Creator, God, not from man. And that's being turned on its head. Now, I looked up in the Merriam-Webster dictionary what liberty is. It is the quality or state of being free. The power to do as one pleases. Freedom from physical restraint. How about this one? This is pretty relevant today. Freedom from arbitrary or despotic control. That's where we're headed. Real quick. Just for the heck of it, I always looked up freedom. So liberty is the quality of state of being free. Freedom, same dictionary, the quality of state or being free. Boy, that sounds almost identical, but they give slightly different examples. The absence of necessity, coercion, or constraint in choice or action. Right now the Supreme Court is really tackling coercion. That was tackled today. They were talking about the individual mandate. I mean, if that's not coercion, what is? I mean, really. B, liberation from slavery or restraint or from the power of another. Independence. C, the quality or state of being exempt or released, usually from something onerous. That's freedom and liberty. That's what we have. That's what's constitutionally guaranteed. Well, it was. Now, I'm an engineer. I work with engineering principles. Principles of nature. Fundamental principles of nature. These are things that Congress didn't put into place and they cannot repeal, thankfully. One of them is the conservation of energy. You've probably heard of this. Energy can't be created or destroyed. That's why we need to dig up coal to make electricity. You can't make electricity from nothing. You have to make it from something else. All we can do with energy is convert it from one place to another or transport it from one place to another. Right? Convert it from one form to another, transport it from one place to another. And that's it. So if we want electricity as an end product, it's got to come from some other energy. It's got to come from somewhere. It doesn't come from nothing. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. That is one of the fundamental laws of nature. And it's one of the very few that is irrefutable. There are very few that are irrefutable. Global warming is not one of them, let me tell you. It's about as far away from irrefutable as you can get. For instance, you drove here today. You have less gas in your car than before you made the trip. Where'd that gas go? Well, some went out with heat from your radiator, out your tailpipe, combustion byproduct. Some of it stayed in the road, etc. It's still out there. It's in a different form. And it got you here, which I'm presuming is a good thing. You at least got a good meal out of it, right? I think there's a principle of liberty that's pretty similar. There's conservation of liberty. This thing that we call liberty, freedom, the state of being free. Whatever it is, there's a finite amount of it, all of it. And it resides either with the individual or it resides with the state. So let's look at that. And this is conjecture basically. I'm not a political scientist, I'm an engineer, but I kind of came up with this. The statement that liberty cannot be created nor destroyed, can only be converted from one form to another and or transported from one place to another, just like energy. So we have this big red circle here that is what happens when 100% of liberty resides with individuals, and we call that anarchy, no government. Now the problem with that form of government is that somebody can use their freedom to impinge on somebody else's freedom. If I go to my neighbor's house and I steal something of his, I am exercising my freedom, right? Nobody's going to argue that. But I'm also impeding my neighbor's freedom. So I think we would all agree that anarchy is not a good form of government. I hear in the newspapers when they talk about Tea Parties, they always talk about us as an anti-government group. We are not. That's absolutely false. We are a limited government group. We're not anti-government, nor, by the way, are we anti-tax. Limited taxation that comes with limited government. They don't get that. Of course, they want to paint us as anti. Any anarchists here? You know, I apologize if I offended an anarchist. Are there any anarchists in here? People who want no government? No government?
They're busy at Occupy Wall Street.
They're busy on Occupy Wall Street. Okay. Now, the other end of the spectrum, the turquoise circle over there, is what happens when freedom and liberty resides 100% with the state. And I could label this as North Korea. But it's statism. The individual has no freedom or liberty. It's all dictated by the small elite running the state. That's statism. I don't think anybody would argue. I don't think even my liberal friends would argue that that's a good form of government. But that's kind of where we're headed. Now, if liberty can't be created or destroyed, it can only be transferred state to individual or vice versa. This is a representation then, when you put those two circles together, of what balanced government should look like. Out of this big pie that we call freedom and liberty, most of it resides in the individual, and a little bit of that we give to the state for what? Protection. Military. That's constitutional provision that Congress has. Maintain a military. What's the military for? Protection of the nation. At the local level, we give some of our tax dollars to maintain police and firefighters. We give a little bit of what we have, a little bit of the fruits of our labor for that protection. And then you can argue beyond that, there is some public works, maintaining of sewers and roads and that kind of thing. But beyond that, that should be it for government. That's the purpose of government. What is it today? The welfare state. Right now, Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security pay out more than 100% of tax revenues coming in. Just those three programs. That's just cutting checks to other people. That's it. That is not a legitimate form of government. That is not a legitimate function of government. That means that military, the entire operation of government, all the agencies, everything is on borrowed or printed money. Because just those three entitlement programs, the welfare programs, suck up more than 100% of tax revenue. That means all the legitimate functions of government are borrowed money. Or printed, or both. They do both. So this is a representation of what a constitutional government looks like. Most of the liberty resides with the individual, a little bit with the state, basically for our protection. But if the state cannot create its own freedom and liberty, it has to take it from us, right? There has to be a transfer of that freedom and liberty from the individual to the state for the state to become more powerful. It can't just become more powerful on its own. It becomes more powerful at the expense of the individual becoming less powerful. Right? That's the balance. So this is what an unbalanced system looks like, where the government has 75% of the pie and the individual has smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. And that's where we are headed. The government will never stop. I mean, you know that. They're not going to get to a point and say, you know what, yep, we're satisfied, we're big enough. Have you seen that happen yet? It never happens, ever. They always, continually, with every law, regulation, and tax that comes out, take some of our liberty and give it to themselves. And eventually, you have total statism. You see what's happening in Europe, and with England, and boy. In England, there's a school that just banned having best friends. I'm not making that up. It was in the UK Telegraph, I think, or the Daily Mail. It is illegal for school kids to have a best friend, because then they get brokenhearted when the friendship breaks up. Right? Good grief. I mean, are you kidding me? That's where statism takes you. They will micromanage your life. There was a famous quote by C.S. Lewis that perfectly encapsulates the danger of statism. And that is, C.S. Lewis said something to the effect of, and I'm just going to paraphrase, that it's better to live under a robber baron than it is under somebody that's a statist. Because the robber baron, their greed, their cupidity will rest sometimes, it'll sleep sometimes. But for a statist, if they torment you for your own good, if they really believe it's for your own good, they will torment you without end because they do so with the approval of their own conscience. There will be no end to it. And he's exactly right. Now, how do you transfer liberty from the individual to the state? Well, for energy, there's three different ways to change the energy of a system. You can heat a system up. You can apply work on the system, like you do in a car engine, or mass transfer. You just ate dinner. You transfer energy into yourself. For liberty, there's three ways that the state can transfer liberty from the individual to the state, or vice versa, but it never goes vice versa, does it? Here's the three mechanisms. You can probably guess them. Number one is taxation. The more they tax you, the more they're taking away from your freedom. Number two, regulation. This is what I'm really going to hit with the EPA. Every regulation, no matter how benign it sounds, no matter how innocent sounding it is, chips away at your freedom. Number three, deficit spending. These are the three ways that they transfer liberty from you and me to them. Some laws focus on one, some laws are all the above. Like Obamacare. Higher taxes, regulation, oh you bet. And deficit spending. It is not a paid-for program. It adds to the deficit. And the CBO just the other week, it's double the original estimate. Yeah, shocker. And let me tell you, it's going to be a lot worse than that when they really get it going, unless the Supreme Court stops in its tracks, which I really hope they do, because if they don't, there's no limit to government. There is no more limited government. That whole concept got thrown out the window if that stays. So there's 3 ways that government could take your liberty. And they can do it by legislation. It's easy. They can do it by executive fiat, executive orders. No problem. Deficit spending is probably the easiest one. And all of these things just transfer liberty and freedom from you to them. Now, in the Declaration of Independence, I brought this up before. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is among those. And it's funny, they chip away at all of them. The founders were brilliant in putting those in that term, because you can't pursue happiness without liberty, and you can't have liberty without life. They're chipping away at every single one of those, including life. I mean, abortion, #1 killer of Americans. They don't value life. Obamacare, death panels. If you're not paying taxes into the system, your life has no value to the statist. So if you're done in your productive years, that hip replacement, you know what? It's really not worth it to the state. You're no longer a taxpayer like you used to be. And small children, they don't pay taxes, they're not going to for a while, so you know what? The younger they are, their chances of getting care, forget it. They are of little value to the state. Now, one thing I hear from people, this was brought up, not before I talked to you guys, but before that, and I talk to groups every couple of months and that kind of thing. And somebody told me that they brought up this issue that God is apolitical and the Bible is apolitical, and I told them that they're wrong. And I searched around and I found this in the Old Testament, first book of Samuel, chapter 8, when Israel asked for a king for the first time. And God made it pretty clear that that was a sin. God doesn't want us to be ruled by a small elite. And they mention kings, but kings never run anything by themselves. It's always the kings in their court and their small group of czars, just this very small elite that makes the decisions for everybody else. It always boils down to an oligarchy, always. God didn't want us to live under that. He doesn't want us to be ruled by a small elite. He wants us to worship Him as free men. And if you read through 1 Samuel 8, he lists a whole bunch of things that, okay, if you guys really want the king, this is what's going to happen to you. This is what the king is eventually going to do to you. And you can read that and it applies just as much today as it did then. The king's going to take this, the king's going to take that, the king's going to... And you know what? You read through that list, and there's not one thing positive that says, oh, by the way, the king will give you this, by the way, in return. It doesn't even exist in there. It's all a list of things that you are going to lose, and it's a list of the freedoms and liberties that you are going to lose. And it's just as true today as it was then. So, not exactly apolitical, is it? It's pretty clear. God doesn't want us to live under the rule of a small elite, being ruled by men. Wants us to live free. Let me just go on here. I don't want to run out of time. Let me talk about the EPA, because this has to do with the second mechanism for taking your freedoms, and that's regulation. And it's getting really, really bad. You know, one of my biggest fears is that the EPA has really been pulling its punches, and they're waiting just in case Obama gets reelected for the really bad stuff to roll out. I mean, you think it's bad now. They're just waiting, right? If they rolled out the real bad stuff right now, and things really started tanking, Obama would just lose in November. And there's no question about that. He may still, just because his policies are creating things like $4 gas, which may go to $5 gas this summer. If that stays high, I mean, he may have done himself in, which, by the way, would be just fine with me, in a political sense. But anyway, the EPA, if you read the EPA statement of when they were founded and what the purpose was, it just sounds benign and great intentions and all this. And it's just become this thing that just grows and grows without end. And it circumvents parts of the Constitution. We have guarantee of personal property. Unless the EPA comes and says your front lawn's a wetland. And then, by the way, you just lost no due process in that. Somebody could just come to your house and say, you know what, that's a wetland. You can't do anything with your land. Totally bypass the Constitution by executive fiat, basically. Not even legislative. It's executive fiat. So the EPA was founded under good intentions, but that was then. And this is now. Here's a nice little regulation that they came out with. 2009, they announced it. The EPA moved to classify cow's milk as oil. Right? So you look at the back of a milk carton and the nutritional label, there's fat in there. That's an oil. And they said, you know what? We can regulate that. And we are going to force farmers, if you want to milk cows, you have to have a spill containment plan. You know, it would be funny. Saturday Night Live could have come up with a better skit. This was a real regulation. That Obama, by the way, put it on hold. He mentioned this in his last State of the State address. That, oh yeah, you know what, I'm going to do away with this absurd regulation. Well, your people are coming up with these absurd regulations. And the most ludicrous ones, we're just going to set aside. All right, what about the other equally ludicrous ones? And you know, the worst ones are just waiting. They're just waiting for November. In case he gets in, let me tell you, you're going to see some things. This one's going to come back, by the way. You know it's going to come back. Set it aside. It was great for a political speech. It's going to come back. They're going to do it. That is theft of freedom right there. The Department of Labor wants to make it illegal for your kids to work on your farm if they're underage. Can you believe that? It's the way it's been done for all human history. You take your kid with you. It's a perpetual take your son to work day, every day. That used to be the family thing, yeah? They want to do away with that. Make it illegal for you to have your kid working with you on your farm. I mean, just these absurd things. It is a theft of freedom. No legislation. It's just a regulation that they're going to roll out by fiat. So, not a joke. Easy to laugh at this stuff. These are the absurd things coming down. Now, let me get to cap and trade. It's one of my favorite pictures here, the volcanic eruption. Cap and trade this. God. You know how much CO2 is released? Not to mention all the other compounds that are released out of just one major explosion. It's huge. Does anybody remember here when Mount St. Helens went up?
Yeah.
It affected our weather here.
Yep.
I mean, you could noticeably tell that eruption spewed out far more than the planetary output of SUVs many years over. All right. So the energy tax. This is a tax that's formulated to do nothing about a problem that doesn't exist. I was just talking with some acquaintances over here at the table that when cap and trade was imposed in Europe, emissions went up, not down. They went up. The only positive thing as far as the government was concerned is they got more tax money. Right? It was a theft of liberty and freedom. The problem, or what they said was the problem, got worse, not better. It's always the opposite of what they say. Unintended consequences, etc., etc. Now, let me ask, what's the #1 greenhouse gas in the atmosphere?
CO2.
It's not CO2. It's not methane. Water vapor. Look, our atmosphere is composed of mostly nitrogen, #2. Everything else is a trace gas. Very small amount. The bulk of our atmosphere is nitrogen and oxygen. Everything else is a trace gas. Out of those trace gases, there's some gases that do trap heat that the Earth emits. We call those greenhouse gases. It's only 2% of our atmosphere. It's what we call greenhouse gases. 96% of those greenhouse gases are water vapor. We call that humidity. CO2 is a little over 3%, about 3.5%. Of the 2%, all right? Let me just make that clear. Water, out of 100% of greenhouse gases, water vapor is 96% of all greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. CO2, 3.5% of greenhouse gases. But that doesn't even go far enough. Out of all the CO2 in the atmosphere, how much is contributed by humanity, human activity, versus nature? How much of that CO2 do you think we contribute to?
1%.
About 3%. Of all the CO2 in the atmosphere is man-made. Well, that means that 97% is coming from nature. Where does CO2 come from? #1 source is the oceans. Try to cap and trade that, good luck. #2 is decaying vegetation, forests. Man is only 3.5%. The Heritage Foundation got a nice little graphic up here each one of these squares is 1 unit. So there's 100 squares in here. So this is 100% of all the greenhouse gases. See this little yellow over on the side here? That's CO2. That's how much CO2 plays as far as greenhouse gases go. See that red dot over there? You probably can't see that. That's human contribution of CO2. So as far as greenhouse gases go, look, if there was a flood and you stood outside and you just whipped it out and peed into it, you are technically contributing to that flood.
Yeah.
Just to give you an idea of what we're doing as far as global warming goes, okay? So yeah, we're technically contributing to greenhouse gases. Not much. So that's the numbers. It's the numbers you probably don't hear much about in the mainstream media. You know, I'm going to pass by this. You can find this, but people in the EPA, ever since the Obama administration came in, have been muzzled. You may remember back in the Bush years when James Hansen, the NASA scientist, I'll put scientist in quotes, but he's a scientist, he's a PhD, but he went to the press and I'm being muzzled, even though he's talking every single week to these gigantic groups and making money off them, it turns out. That was a fake story, but the media ran with it anyway. But real EPA employees have been muzzled by this administration from talking out about cap and trade and how bad it is. It's a proven track record. It's not a new idea. It's been rolled out in Europe and other places, proven to be a failure. And these scientists were muzzled. You can look up their names. Heck, look up that headline right there. You'll find it. They got a little video. I was going to play that, but don't want to hold this too long. How many people out there are food coma settling in? I don't see anybody dozing off yet, so that's a good thing. But the two scientists' names, they were actually lawyers, not scientists, but Lori Williams and her husband, Alan Zabel, they were working for the EPA for something like 20 years in looking at cap and trade. And they were muzzled. They were told, take your post offline or be fired. And that was it. So you want to hear about somebody getting muzzled? That's the real story of people getting muzzled. So I'm not going to play that video, but let me get to the ice core data. This is where it gets really interesting as far as global warming goes. There was news that came out within the last couple of days that should put the last nail in the coffin of the global warming hoax. And I'm going to get to that. Now, does everybody know NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, is the government entity that keeps track of what's going on with climate, amongst other things. Did you see the movie The Day After Tomorrow?
Yes.
Where right at the beginning they're drilling ice cores in Antarctica and that big shelf breaks off and Dennis Quaid almost falls in and really over-dramatized. Remember the big long ice cores are big cylinders that they drill into the ice, and the farther down you go, the farther back in time that you go. And if you look at the way the ice is packed down, you can back out a whole bunch of things about what the climatic conditions were backwards in time. It's an indirect measurement. It's never going to be as good as putting a sensor out there, but we didn't have sensors 200 years ago or thousands of years ago, anything like that. So we have to rely on ice cores and tree rings and sediment cores and a whole bunch of other things. But the interesting thing is if you go on NOAA.gov, you'll reach a page that looks just like this. And you can actually go in and find ice core data. It's online for public use. And you can back out temperatures from any ice core sample on the planet, which really means South Pole or closer to North Pole. Greenland's a pretty common one. Northern Greenland ice core goes very, very deep. And that's what I pulled off here. As a matter of fact, I got a pull-down menu. I took a screenshot right here. You can pull it down and just pull down which sample you want. I pulled down Northern Greenland, and you get temperature records. So over on the left-hand side here, this is temperature. Now it's Northern Greenland. It's cold. So that minus 31, that's minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. It's cold. It's Northern Greenland. What do you expect it's going to be? It's not going to be 60. There'd be no ice. No ice, no ice core. So there is no Michigan ice core pull down. Right, the ice comes and goes. You got a core. You can do your own core. Well, not this last year. Maybe next year, for a couple of months. That's it for cores. But this goes back about 600 years, and you can see on the right-hand side there was some warming that began. Now, just look at the scale. This is a fraction of 1 degree. All right. So this is not like a 10-degree change or anything like that. It's a fraction of 1 degree, and it started in around 1850. At the end of what was known as the Little Ice Age. It was cold for a while. But this goes back farther. So this came before the Industrial Revolution. This warming started. All right, before the Industrial Revolution. So it couldn't be us. right? Well, that's what you'd think, but you'd be wrong, according to them. Let me go a little backwards in time. This goes back now to 800 AD. Now, on the right-hand side, this blip here is what they're worried about. And if you go backwards in time, you got the little ice age here, this big dip. Well, what the heck is this mountain here? You know, this is pretty similar to when they talk about recessions and say, you know, this is the worst recession we've had since the Great Depression. I'm like, you know, when I was a kid in Detroit, I remember the 70s, late 70s, and it was a lot worse than it was today. My dad was laid off from Ford for a year. There were gas lines. I remember waiting with my dad in gas lines. 45 minutes, gas was rationed. You could only get 5 gallons at a time. What happened to that speed bump backwards in time? You go backwards in time. Before they got to the Great Depression, what happened to that big speed bump in the late 70s?
Spaceships.
Man, those times were really, really bad. And interest rates were high, and inflation was high, and mortgage rates were 20%. It was not a good time. I remember those. That was what they call stagflation now. It was a really bad time for America. Reagan turned that around. We need another one of him today. Unfortunately, none available at this time. Frustrating primaries, man, I tell you. But anyway, this area here in time from about 800 to 1200 AD, this was called the medieval warm period. The medieval warm period. This time there are historical records. This is just ice core data, but there are historical written records of these very exotic grapes being grown in northern England that to this day cannot grow because it's too cold. Vineyards were sprawling. Northern England. Too cold today. Those records exist out there. People writing about what they did and what they grew and how warm it was. During this time, Greenland, guess what the color of Greenland was? Green! What color is it today? White! It was warmer. Greenland was colonized. The Vikings sailed there in colonies and crops, and it was a good, warm time. On the upswing. On the downswing, guess what they were doing? On the downswing, they were burning people at the stake throughout Europe for changing the climate. Ooh. Sound familiar? Well, we don't burn people at the stake anymore, but they do get burned at the stake in the media, don't they? They get muzzled. They lose their jobs. They get threatened. They get intimidated. Not a whole lot different from what they did back then. Culturally, I guess back then, hey, burning at the stake was just kind of, you know what, just burn them at the stake. I don't know. Didn't have a media back then or something. But let me just go a little backwards in time. So we are not in some area of unprecedented warming. It's been warmer before, globally. And as a matter of fact, within the last few days, this was serendipitous. This news came out, this is from the UK Mail on, that I'm wondering at this time, because I referred to so much to UK Telegraph and UK, how come I'm not reading this in the papers here on this side of the pond? Where is this in the Washington Post and the New York Times and Detroit Free Press? You know, I got to read this overseas. So overseas, they found a mineral from which they can back out temperatures that are not ice core data. Because, right, here's the theory that they came up with once they saw this, the warming alarmists. They said, you know what? Yeah, we have a peak here, but it only happened in Europe. It didn't happen anywhere else. I'm not kidding. Look at this next graph. I love this graph. I pulled it off the internet. This graph is from the 1990 IPCC report. This is the UN International Panel on Climate Change. This was the data that they relied on. If you look at their report today, that whole bump is gone. Because they argued, you know what? Because people looked at that and said, well, what are you talking about, global warming? What happened during this medieval warm period? So you know what? They just erased that out of history, saying, you know what, it only happened in Europe. And nowhere else. Well, okay, well that's satisfying. Well, it turns out that scientists found out through looking at this mineral, they can back out temperature data from isotopes from this very rare mineral that's spread throughout the Earth. And they found that warming was not only in Europe, it was global all the way down to Antarctica. And they had a map of it. It's a really, this came out, let's see, is there date on this? March 26th. It is March 27th. I would encourage you to read that.
So long ago.
I would encourage, this was yesterday's news. It's literally yesterday's news. Not like it was years ago. It's yesterday.
What mineral?
You know, it's an isotope of a mineral. I can't remember the name of the mineral. It might be Ikeite.
What's the name of the paper?
Ikeite. The name of the paper, this is the UK Mail Online. UK Mail Online. But the mineral is named right here. There's a mineral called Ikeite, and it proved that that warming in the medieval warm period was not located just in Europe. It was global. It was everywhere. The whole planet warmed. They have just lost that argument. Because now, yes sir.
One of the reasons why they had that so-called warming period in the 90s is about half of the measuring stations in the Arctic Circle, especially in Russia, were closed down. Naturally breaking up
Plus there's
the average temperature.
Yeah, plus there's cycles in the oceans, the El Nino and the La Nina. And you know, one thing that you notice about the climate record as I go on here, so this goes back 800 years. If I go farther back in time, this goes back now 5,000 years from today. This is the same ice core data from northern Greenland. So this is what they're worried about now. This is the medieval warm period. What the heck is this? This was even warmer. They call this the Holocene optimal. And it was really warm back then. You tend to neglect that. Look how warm it was. Let's go backwards in time a little more because the ice core goes deeper. This goes back now 10,000 years. You want to see global warming? Look on the left side of that graph. You see this big, gigantic warming? What is that? That's us coming out of the Ice Age. Let's go backwards in time a little more. So this is now us in the Ice Age. This is what they're worried about now. I can't even, it's somewhere up there. But we were in a very long period where we had an Ice Age. Very long period. Michigan was under a glacier. You and I wouldn't be here right now under those temperatures. Here's a scary one I'm going to show you. This goes back now, if you believe the time scales, more than 400,000 years. Period of warming, Ice Age, small period of warming, Ice Age, small period of warming, Ice Age, small period of warming, Ice Age. It's a very, very long cycle. And see, the problem with this whole theory of climate change is that our lifespan is very short compared to the historical record of the Earth. There are cycles that are so long they're beyond our lifetime, and we can't observe them. It would be, I always give this analogy, let's imagine that you were a being that only had a lifespan of 2 weeks. And you were born early December. And your kids were born middle of December. And your grandkids were born end of December. And 8 generations later, March comes around and starts to warm. And in 8 generations, you haven't seen any warming. And then their kids track throughout March and into April this warming. And oh my goodness, what are we doing to the planet? And they're predicting by December, the whole Earth's going to be on fire. Well, of course it's not. It's a cycle, but it's a very long cycle compared to their short lifespan. Well, that's how we are. Our lifespan's within 100. You know, it's interesting, in the Bible, God limited to 120 years. What's the maximum lifespan? The oldest people in the world, 117, 115. It's right around 120. It's pretty cool. That's it. But compared to some of these cycles and some of these variations, I mean, look at that graph. There is no steady state. There is no constant. The only constant is the climate always changes. Nothing to do with us. So let me back up to the medieval warm period. Now that there is proof, scientific proof, that the entire globe was warm back in the medieval warm period. There were no SUVs, coal power plants, petroleum. Okay, guys, now tell us why it was warmer. Because I'd kind of like to know. Anybody ever see the Al Gore movie, Inconvenient Truth? I watched it a few times. It was a very well-made movie, and I'm very jealous of the big screens that he has. As a professor, I mean, I'm always showing graphs, data. Love those screens. He had to climb up on a ladder. But he had a screen where on top it was CO2 and on the bottom was temperature. Or maybe it was the other way around. And those graphs were right. What he didn't do, his big mistake was, he didn't overlay the two. If he would have overlaid the two, they don't 100% match up. One thing goes up first, and then the second thing goes up second. And CO2 never goes up first. Temperature always goes up first, and then CO2 follows it. There's like a century and a half lag. It always happens. Look, and why does that happen? When temperature goes up, CO2 goes up. What's the number one source of CO2 again? Oceans. Whenever you boil water, you put water in a stock pot and you put it on a burner. And within minutes, what do you see on the side of the pot? There's bubbles. Water holds air dissolved in itself just like air holds water dissolved in itself. We call it humidity. But there's air inside water, and if the temperature goes up or the pressure goes down, it comes out of solution. That includes CO2. So if the ocean's warm, for whatever reason, it's going to release a tremendous amount of CO2. But the CO2 doesn't drive the temperature, it's the other way around. He had the right data, he didn't show it correctly. Big mistake. Now, they can't let go of it though. Let me tell you that this data that was just released is not going to convince these people otherwise. There has been no warming for 15 years. Even though their models, every single computer model predicted runaway greenhouse effect, warming to no end, sea level rises of 20 degrees, cats and dogs living together, you know, the whole, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. Why? Well, because they're wrong. But you can't convince them otherwise. Doesn't matter what science you throw at them. You will never convince them otherwise. Why are they hanging on to this thing? It's got nothing to do with money. It's got nothing to do with money. Maybe a little bit. It's the power. This is the ring of power for the statist. If you want to talk about transferring freedom, they want to create an all-powerful UN. Just erase. Look, if they can erase U.S. sovereignty, the Constitution's gone. If they can do that by treaty, it's gone. Treaties supersede the Constitution. It's in the Constitution. They can basically give up our sovereignty. If we do that, we just gave up all our freedom and liberty. Forget the Second Amendment. Forget all the amendments. We're done. And there's no place else to go. I mean, the Pilgrims sailed here to find a new place. There is no new place out there. They cannot let go of this. This is the Sauron's ring of power from Lord of the Rings, man. They cannot let go of this idea that they need something, some pretense to form a one world government around saving the planet from problems, by the way, doesn't exist. But they need something. And there is nothing else to replace global warming. But it's not happening. It's a joke. It's so low on the list of voter priority as to almost be non-existent. Yeah.
Well, that's why they call it climate change now. They've changed the argument.
Well, they don't call it climate change anymore either. They don't call it climate disruption. Now they're talking about wacky weather and this big warm thing that we just had in Michigan and record temperatures in Chicago. Well, it's record temperatures over the last 120 years. Chicago, the land that Chicago's on has been around much longer than that. Guess what? You guys don't have records of that. So it may not be. But you know what? As we had record colds in Alaska, we had record colds throughout Europe. Globally, I mean, this is supposed to be global climate change. You know, whenever you talk about them and say, you know what, all the snow that we're getting, remember last year, all the snow? Well, shoot, people that said this is opposite global, oh, no, you can't confuse weather with climate. But then when we get a heat wave like we got here in March, all of a sudden, well, this weather, this wacky weather, well, darn it, that's climate change, and we're called, you know, weather is climate as long as they say that it's climate, and if it's not, then anyway, yeah.
Well, you could see the disproof on your local news every day if they show you the record highs and lows. You will see most record highs have been in the 1930s and 40s, long before the SUVs and everything we're doing
Yeah,
now.
but even if we do set new records, they only have records that go back 100-some years. Michigan has been around much longer, and they don't have all the records going back in time.
Yeah.
So that's problematic
Even
when
in
they
the
say that.
100-year time frame, it's not true. And
Yeah.
you see it on the local news every day.
Yeah, the highest global temperature that we've had is in the 1930s. I think it was 33. Yeah.
When I was in high school in the 60s, they were talking about global cooling.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
Michigan was going to become a tundra again.
Yeah, and it was our fault too. It was our fault too.
And it was
The NASA scientist James Hansen was one of those that was decrying global cooling back in the 70s, and he's now a global warming proponent. It doesn't matter what happens, we're at fault, and the only solution is socialism, always. It doesn't matter, temperature goes up, it doesn't matter. Remember last year when it snowed, they said, you know, that's global warming. We're putting more moisture out there. And this year it didn't snow. Well, that's global warming. It doesn't matter what happens, it's always the same thing. We're responsible, the only solution is socialism. Every time. Never works. Let me just go on here. I'm going to skip through a few of these slides. Some of the coldest temperatures in Britain. Here's a good statement from EPA chief Lisa Jackson. This is a quote from her, by the way. She was asked this in 2010. Because we haven't had any warming since 97, 98, right around there. So 15 years we have no warming. This is what she said. This is the director of the EPA. 15 years with no statistically significant increase in global temperatures does not mean that the human race is not causing climate change. What do you say to that?
Fire.
Okay, so nothing's changing, but that doesn't mean that we're not changing something. Really? So the EPA, a couple of things the EPA has been doing the last few years. Number one, you might have seen this ad before. This is from
Yeah.
American Lung Association in Michigan. It is illegal to use taxpayer money to campaign, except for the EPA. Because they funnel money to the American Lung Association of Michigan. And then they run ads against Fred Upton. Well, how is that not using our money to campaign? How is that not using our money to campaign? Oh, it gets worse. The EPA is using our money to sue itself. This is how it works. This is from Investors Business Daily, July 6, 2011. You can look it up. It's still on Google. I checked. The title is EPA funds green groups that sue the agency to expand. So they give money to a green group, and that green group then sues the EPA back to put a regulation into place, for instance, to keep California, Southern California dry, to save a fish that may not be endangered, and all this other stuff. They're getting funded by the EPA. And then the EPA goes to court, puts up a weak argument, loses, and puts the regulation into place. Rinse, repeat. That's our taxpayer money. That's one of the mechanisms that they have established to continually just grow without limit. Question, sir?
Yeah, one thing they never mention as far as in regards to science is CO2 is a non-static gas. It's constantly being recycled.
Oh, sure it is.
It's
Yeah, CO2 is a natural compound. CO2 is a natural compound.
And it's being absorbed by vegetation constantly.
Yep.
It recycles oxygen out, which we breathe.
Yep. Now, so the EPA gets sued by the green groups that it funds. And not only that, when EPA loses in court, they have to pay the court costs for that green group too. It's not a joke. I mean, Saturday Night Live can run skits on this stuff. It's not a joke. But it is. Let's see, let me skip through here. This is what's been going on with CO2 historically. It hasn't changed much. It's about 360 parts per million right now. This is from tree ring data that a scientist came up with 2 years ago. This is CO2 from 1826 to 1960. It's down, not much. Look, the planet used to be warmer than it is right now. CO2 levels used to be several times what it is right now. And if I could show you a short video real quick, I'll skip by this. Whoop. Back up here. This is an experiment that they did on 2 plants at different CO2 concentrations over 42 days.
Oops.
Foreign TV, the world is thinking.
This is the way the EPA is described.
I have had conversations
This is great.
with individual members of Congress. I have absolutely no problem saying publicly what I've said to you here. I kind of thought this was public. But, you know, this is the problem with Washington right now. Washington is a giant self-licking ice cream cone.
I can just stop it right there. Doesn't that describe the EPA perfectly? Funds groups to sue itself, to expand, to fund more groups, to sue itself, to expand. It's a self-licking ice cream cone. If you go on Google and look at the CO2 in plants, they show 2 plants growing, one at a higher CO2 concentration, and it's almost double in size, double the growth rate. CO2 is plant food. It's not a pollutant. It's never been a pollutant. Jupiter has been warming. Pluto has been warming. Mars has been warming. They never had that in the John Carter movie, by the way. They didn't show warming. Mars, they have some statistically significant warming there. Whatever warming is occurring here has nothing to do with us. It's got nothing to do with us. These are inconvenient facts. There's no SUV. You know, in John Carter, they didn't have those flying ships, didn't they? Darn it, they're polluting the planet.
Yep.
Here's an interesting, remember the law of unintended consequences. In Australia last year, they had record flooding. You know why? They were unprepared for it. Because the global warming people were telling them, prepare for droughts.
Yeah.
They didn't prepare for floods. Again, you got to read the overseas papers. You might be asking, am I from Britain? Why am I referencing these British papers? Because I cannot find this stuff in the Detroit Free Press, the Washington Post, or the New York Times. I got to go to the UK papers, Telegraph, Daily Mail, etc., and find this. What was the role of war mist in Queensland flood disaster? And they talk about that the preparedness, emergency preparedness that these municipalities were preparing for was drought. Because they were telling them, forget floods, you're never going to see water again. Just like they were telling us, we'll never see snow again. Till last year. Well, that's our cause too. Now, what's the EPA doing right now? Cap and trade did not pass Congress. Even when Obama had a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, they couldn't pass cap and trade. Passed by the House, it was another one of these gigantic multi-thousand-page bills. Nobody read. Passed it in the dead of night. But they couldn't get it through the Senate. So what are they having the EPA do? They're going to... That news just broke this week. That right now, new coal power plants, there's one company out west that's being shuttered because they are supposed to meet this new CO2 regulation. They're installing cap and trade. It's a killer. Because new coal power plants are more efficient than the old coal power plants. They're better. So meanwhile, look, if you're the EPA and you're looking at pollution, don't you want to get rid of the old ones and put new technology in place? Apparently not. They will not allow new one to be built. Remember, this was a campaign promise by Obama. They can build a new coal power plant, but they're going to go bankrupt doing it. I'm going to make sure of that, and he sure as heck did. By executive fiat, bypassing Congress. All this stuff he's just bypassing. In fact, Obamacare, they're arguing right now. That was through reconciliation, if you remember. Not normal procedures. Just bad stuff. You know, I'm going to skip by this. I'd like this to be interactive, and I'm already a little over time. I want to answer questions. I want to have some time to answer questions before everybody leaves. Yes, sir?
Chris, can you address the thing that Obama keeps spewing about us using 20% of the energy in the world?
Yeah, we only have 2% of the world's population. We're using 20% of the energy. You know, when he talks about how much oil we have, he's talking proven reserves. Proven reserves is not all the oil that we have. We have technically recoverable oil. It's not a proven reserve. Proven reserve ought to have an asterisk. To be a proven reserve, you have to meet these government qualifications, right? Everything's a definition to them. But they, by the way, change. It's like changing the definition of person, right? Unborn or not people. They used to do that in the slave days. Person meant one thing in the Constitution for whites and a totally different thing for black people. They're doing the same thing with the unborn, just to change the definition. But for oil, proven oil reserves, they have a definition for that. And shale oil is not included in that. Oil sands is not included in that. The Bakken Formation, etc. You can just go down the list. We have a whole lot more energy than he says we do. We have a whole lot more. And that's just from petroleum. We've got a couple of centuries at least of recoverable petroleum, just for us. In addition, we have the biggest coal reserves on the planet here in North America. We're not going to be shy of coal for probably a millennium. Plus naturally, and they're finding new stuff, new ways, economically feasible ways, hydraulic fracturing now, etc. They're going to keep finding better technology to do this. We're not short on energy. What we are short on is political smarts. I mean, we really are. These people want us to go backwards. Better technology will let us go forwards. Our air quality is better now than it was in 1950. We use many times more energy today, in total and per capita, than we did in 1950. Our air is cleaner. Why? Technology. Japan has recovered from their tsunami, earthquake, Fukushima, etc. Haiti's not going to recover for a generation. It's a lack of technology. They just don't have access. Japan does. There are other developed countries, as you saw on the slide. Access to energy, technology, that's what's going to get us ahead. Environmentally, too. Going backwards is going to put us behind every single way, economically, environmentally, etc. Yes?
I just want to add something, and you touched on the United Nations before. There's a UN Agenda 21, and regardless of what we prove on cap and trade and what happens, you know, there's a reason for our president and our Congress and governors to control energy, and it's written up in the UN Agenda 21.
Yeah, UN Agenda 21, that came out decades ago, and that is a plot. I don't have any other way to say it. It's a plot to get us all under the thumb of a one world government, and they're going to use the environmental issue to do it through Agenda 21. Demand this thing they call sustainability that they define. They want to get us all under the thumb. For the environment's all good. For the environment's own good. For some reason, they always exclude us from the environment. Aren't we part of the? I always thought we were part of the environment, top of the food chain and all that. Oh, they'll use whatever they can. They'll use whatever excuse they can to try to do that. Yep, it's happening, and it's all the way at the local level. Planning boards are on board with this stuff. It's bad. I mean, it's.
We need to look at those that have endorsed expanded regulations on
Yep.
Clean Air Act, on captive trade.
Yeah, we don't need more regulation. We need less. Yes, sir.
Sir, a week ago last Sunday, or it was Saturday rather, on the Larry Kudlow show, which is on WJR from 7 to 10 p.m., he reported that including fracturing, horizontal drilling, oil shale, and all the other new techniques we have 60 times the amount of oil than the 2% that Barack Obama reports. 60 times as much.
Yeah, we have enough to get us many centuries.
Enough for all of our oil needs for 200 years.
Yeah, probably more, but yeah, 200 years is a good estimate for petroleum. For coal, it's longer than that. For natural gas, probably longer than that. We've got plenty of energy. That doesn't mean we ought to be wasteful. My biggest area that I teach in is energy management. That is doing what you need to do, but not wasting energy, because it's costing you money. You don't want to throw away your money. I sure don't want to throw away mine. Energy efficiency is a big deal for me. So when I deal in clean technology and clean energy, my biggest issue is energy efficiency, not forcing something out there that's not economically feasible.
But it would be your choice.
Well, exactly. That's the whole point. If something saves you money, economic feasibility, why would you not implement it? But forcing something out there that's not economically feasible, that's a totally different story. Yes?
Do you have any information on the depths of drilling? I was at a seminar once where they mentioned in Russia they're drilling literally 40,000 feet, or I might get my numbers, but twice as far down as we drill, and they're still getting tons of oil, and it was putting,
You know, how far down they drill, that's got to do with proven oil reserves versus technically recoverable oil reserves. How far down you can drill, they're always going to be finding new stuff. I mean, the Earth's crust is, what, 26 miles
What
thick?
does it have to do with the dinosaurs? Is it really a true fossil fuel, or is it a renewable source because of microorganisms in the crust? I mean,
Well,
do you
where does all of that come from? All of it came from biological material in the first place. It's just, when we talk about renewal, you burn a log or you burn corn stove and it grows back next year. With coal and that kind of thing, it's a much longer time scale. So I guess if our lifespans were longer, we might consider it that way, but don't know. There's different theories about how that stuff's formed. You can form coal in a lab in weeks if you put it under the right conditions. If you put biomass under the right conditions, you can form coal in a matter of weeks, not millions of years. It's been done in university labs. Do those conditions exist out there? I don't know. There's a lot of unknowns with that. Yes, sir.
According to the Wall Street Journal of 5 years ago, many of the deep oil fields are naturally killing themselves, and we don't know why.
Yeah, some of there's oil pockets out there that should have ran dry a long time ago, and the level hasn't changed yet. So something's going on over there. Yes, sir.
Do you suppose OPEC has any incentive to depress exploration in the United States?
Who does?
OPEC.
OPEC. Well, sure. I mean, they want control of all the oil. I mean, why wouldn't they? They don't need to do that. Our administration is doing just fine. There's a war on energy in this country, and it's a shame because we're going in the opposite direction that we should be going in. Any questions over here? I didn't get anybody over here. Yes, sir.
A couple years ago, I read, on where our oil and that came from. They think it came from when the Earth made itself. There's a moon in Uranus that's almost as big as the Earth, where they have literally oceans the size of the Atlantic Oceans that are nothing but pure methane, which means there's probably much more on our planet than...
Hey, that'd be a Keystone XL over there. That's
Well, what are we going to do something about it instead of shove it up our ass?
Well, you know what? We don't have a space program anymore, so we'll never get there. So NASA now tracks global warming. That's what they do. Yeah.
A little closer to home, it's a global economy. our domestic oil supplies can and are being shipped overseas. So, you know, we have enough oil for ourselves, but free trade allows it to be shipped
Well,
to the highest
we're
customer.
still importing 50% of the petroleum.
Right, but if we doubled our output and
Oh, sure.
the Chinese
We can be
outbid us
we can be
on
an
our
exporting
oil.
country. We sure can.
Well,
We
no,
sure
I'm
can.
I'm saying it as a bad thing, at least until we get caught up. If we could use twice as much oil because we're importing half of it, there's nothing to say that the oil companies can't just ship it overseas because China's going to pay more for it.
Sure, we can export that oil. I mean, it's going on right now with some countries, but on average,
For our
we're,
benefit at that point.
you know, there's arguments to be made about that, economic arguments and that kind of thing, but
Where do you stand on it? I guess that's
on exporting our oil,
yeah.
you know, I'd like us, my number one thing is to get energy independent. I think that's where we need to go.
Right.
We should not be dependent on countries that basically want to wipe us out. I would, look, I'm a clean energy person, and I have no aversions to looking for alternatives, but my number one thing is getting off the foreign stuff. And the only way we're going to be able to do that in the short or medium term is to drill our own oil. We have the oil. We just have to put a straw in the ground.
And not give away islands to Russia.
Not give away oil-rich islands to Russia, right? I want to see that happen first, and then have a discussion. Look, I'm an energy efficiency guy, so I don't like to throw energy away. How do we do the things we need to do from industry, commercial space, municipal space, residential space, etc., to maximize bang for the buck? But we got to become energy independent, and that's got to be drilling our own. Drill here, drill now. That's been out there. We got to do some of that.
Obama said though, if someone tells you that all you need to drill, then they are lying to you and they don't know the facts. So are you telling me that this whole conversation has been a lie and unfounded and that
No.
we want our money back?
No. Remember, Obamacare is not going to pay for health care for illegals, no money towards abortion. I can go down that list real quick.
Problem is, Democrats are better at telling lies than most of the conservatives and Republicans are at telling the truth. Until we get to the point where we can tell the truth better than they can tell their lies, we're going to still be in trouble.
Yep. Does anybody have any other questions? I'll stick around a little bit after the talk. Yeah.
I have a little bit of experience in the oil industry, and what we're doing right now is we're drilling down at 10,000 plus feet in Louisiana, and we're reopening wells that were once closed because there wasn't enough oil in them. We're finding that they're full again, and there's no need to be drilling 2 miles off in the coast, in the Gulf Coast, because they can do it right around New Orleans and
Right. When we had that big leak in the Gulf a little while ago, that was a deep well.
That was a deep well. It was
Deep
2
water.
miles down, but it didn't.
Yeah, but why are we out there? It's exactly to your point. We've got safe place where we can drill right here, but they're off limits.
But even that leak was a manufactured leak. The leak was real, but the disaster was manufactured. They have equipment that could have gathered all that oil. The U.S. government, with Obama's approval, refused the help of the countries that have the machines to gather that oil.
Yep.
So,
Did you like his little press conference in front of the pipes the other day? Those pipes are going to connect to Oklahoma, Texas, but there's a 1,700-mile gap.
Yeah.
So pipe to nowhere. Yeah.
So
That's only the Keystone L. The X ain't there yet. And I think the voters get it. I think the voters get
I
it.
hope
Gas
so,
prices going
because
up.
If we don't, we're going to have a complete breakdown of society.
That was under the Jones Act, right? The foreign ships issue that they kept it out of, the Jones Rule of the Seas
Couldn't
Act.
speak to that. Does anybody have any other questions? I'll stick around a little bit after my talk. Who gets the mic next? Thank you.
Oh, I think we can all agree on one thing. Who knows this stuff? I'll keep it going.